So there have been quite a lot of examples of societies that functioned without what we would recognize as the government. Whether it would work in the modern world, we don't know. We haven't done the experiment.
David, great to have you here again in Brazil. I believe it's your third time?
Correct.
And I've been with you every time you came to Brazil. In 2010, at the first Austrian conference, we were there, gave an excellent speech, and I'm glad to see you again. You spoke tonight about the future imperfect.
Yes.
What will be ways that we can discuss the technology of the future?
What I was discussing were technological revolutions that might happen and what their possible consequences would be and how to deal with them. And that my general view is the future is very uncertain, that things could develop in ways that would make life very much better for people. They could develop in ways that would make things worse. They could develop in ways that would wipe out the human race. I wrote a book on this called Future Imperfect. And after the book was published, I gave a talk on it at Google. And I started the talk by saying that I thought global warming was a pretty wimpy catastrophe, that I could think of 3 different ways of wiping out the human race faster than that. But I can also think of ways of making us very nearly immortal, of making a whole lot of useful things very much less expensive than they now are, of essentially preventing all diseases from killing us. All of those things might happen. And I don't think I can predict which ones will happen. So, as I say, I think people are much too conservative in their view of the future. That I think I started the book actually by describing a conversation the Secretary of Transportation of the U.S., Norman Mineta, was the commencement speaker for my law school. And he was talking to some students afterwards, and he said, someday, perhaps 100 years from now, you're going to put your key in your car's ignition and turn it, and the engine won't start because there'll be no gasoline left in the world. And what struck me was not the bad economics, because if we run out of oil, it'll be a very slow, gradual process of rising prices. Sure. It was the extraordinary conservatism of assuming that 100 years from now, the way people get from one place to another would be by using a car with internal combustion, and the way you started that would be putting a key in your ignition. I don't even start my car that way anymore now, and that was only about 10 years ago. At this point, I push a button, and the key thing in my pocket communicates with the car and tells it I'm there, and it turns on. That in general, people sort of have this automatic assumption the world's going to be like it is in the future, except for something. And that's just not a very good guess.
Right. I believe you and I would agree that technology is amoral.
Yes.
We cannot ascribe morality to technology.
Correct.
So technology can be used for good or for evil.
But some technologies will turn out to have much better potentials for good or for evil than other technologies. No, I agree. The technology itself is neutral. A knife is neither good nor evil. I use a knife to slice my bread, and the same knife could be used by someone else to cut my throat. So it's not as if it's the knife's fault, so
Exactly.
But
yesterday I was at a conference, David, in which the Secretary of State from one of the states in Brazil, responsible for the local IRS, was describing how he's using technology to raise revenues, to raise more revenues. And of course, you might have heard of the Chinese 50-cent party, in which the Chinese state pays 50 cents for an army of 150,000 people to divert discussions online. Not necessarily in favor of the government, but when they're talking against the government, they would divert and troll the conversations. And so it can be used for bad. Why would we then think that we might have technology benefit us and not hurt us?
But the technologies do both. In each case, the online technology also means that somebody who doesn't own a newspaper but has interesting ideas can put those ideas up there where many other people can see them. It means you can make arguments. It means you can write a book and publish it online, or even self-publish very inexpensively. So that one of the things that's been happening, at least in the US, maybe here, is a shift towards eliminating publishers. So that at this point, some people who want to publish a book find a publisher and persuade him to publish it, but that's very hard. And many people just publish the book themselves. And much of that is junk and isn't worth reading, but some of it is very good. And it's really up to them which they do. So I think the technology increases the things people can do. Increasing what I can do is usually good for me. Increasing what you can do might be good for me or might be bad for me because you might be doing something to me. In which case I'm not in favor of it. You might be doing something for me. That if doctors learn to cure diseases better, that's good for the rest of us. If governments learn to control people better, that's probably bad for the rest of us. So there isn't an unambiguous change. And if people are interested, I go into a lot of this in considerable detail in my book, Future Imperfect. And one result of the current technology is you don't have to pay to read my book. You don't have to order it from Amazon, although you can if you feel like it, but the whole book is online from my webpage and you can read it for free because I'm writing books not mainly to get income, but mainly to spread ideas. I like to say that when you're young, you're afraid somebody will steal your idea. When you're old, you're afraid they won't.
You mentioned that you spoke at Google.
Yes.
And one of the people that you mentioned at your speech today was Ray Kurzweil.
Yes.
Who's, I believe, now at Google as well.
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yes. And he is one of the founders of the Singularity University and all the concept of the exponential society.
I think Werner Vinge, actually, who's a science fiction writer and a computer scientist, is the person who first came up with the singularity.
Anyway, he's one of the proponents of the idea. I believe he's actually taking medicine to try to survive up to the point of singularity. Yes. I find it fascinating that we are all talking about this, and of course they are selling a lot of books.
But I don't know whether that particular idea will happen. The idea of the singularity, which is really, I think, Vinge's idea originally.
Explain the singularity.
Sure. The basic idea of that is you have technological progress of a form that makes it easier and easier to have more technological progress. So imagine your technological progress, take a very simple case. Suppose you develop drugs that make people smarter. One of the things smarter people can do is to do a better job of making drugs that make people smarter. Or suppose you develop computers that are very smart. One of the things very smart computers can do is to make even smarter computers. So the idea is that you can imagine a system with positive feedback where you make things a little better and that makes them still better and that makes them still better. And as Vinge imagined it, the singularity is a point at which things change so fast that it doesn't make really sense to us after it happens to understand what happens. So you could imagine this happens, and if you then look at Earth 10 years later, there's nobody there. And you don't know is the reason that people discovered the meaning of life and all committed suicide? Is the reason they all turned into angels and went away? Is the reason they all turned into computer programs and are running somewhere? So that was sort of the original concept. It was really a science fiction concept of reinforcing change.
Do you think we have reached that point already?
I don't think it's going to happen, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
I think it is likely that things are going to change quite a lot. But the argument that I gave implicitly assumes that there's no limit to how much smarter smart drugs can make you, that there's no limit to how much smarter computers can get. We don't know if that's true or not.
Right.
So it seems to me that even with the feedback, let me take the extreme case. Suppose we had a spaceship which somehow had positive feedback, so that when it went faster, that made its engines work better and it went still faster. It still isn't going to get past the speed of light.
Sure.
All right? So you don't really know. You don't really know that change is going to go to infinity. It's an interesting idea. It's not impossible. But what I expect is simply that some areas of change will turn out to be very large. We can't very easily predict what they will be. Mm-hmm. Some of the results could be very attractive, that I'm in favor of a society where things are done by private arrangements, not by government. Mm-hmm. One could imagine ways in which online could develop, indeed in which the online world is developing, in which the things that we're used to doing by government get done privately instead. So that, for example, we think that the way we prevent people from selling things and then not delivering them, from taking your money and not giving you anything, is that the courts will get them. Mm. The way we prevent that on eBay is that when you buy something on eBay, you get to report to eBay whether or not you got what you said.
Reputation
eBay
feedback.
then maintains reputation, and the result is that if you cheat people, you aren't going to be able to use eBay for very long.
Let me get back to the artificial intelligence.
Yes.
You mentioned that there's nothing to stop computers from becoming smarter than people.
My best guess about what I am, and I'm not sure I'm right, is that I am software running on the hardware of my brain.
Right.
If that's right, we know computers can be as smart as people because people are computers.
But you think an algorithm can be like the reason of a human, can mimic the human brain?
I don't know what you mean by an algorithm. We know that a computer program, not a single algorithm, can beat a human being at Go.
That's right.
Because Google created one that would do it. So we know computer programs can do very, very complicated things, and we are getting better at making computers and better at writing programs. But what I'm saying is that if I'm right in my guess that what I am is software running on the brain, then I not only know that in principle one can make a computer that's a human, I also know that that computer will be conscious because I know that I'm conscious, because I'm inside here watching. So in that sense, it seems to me that one has good reason to think that one can eventually make computers as smart as people. We might not. It could be that we're wrong. It could be that for one or a variety of different reasons we can't solve it. It could be that it could be done, but we won't figure out how to do it. Maybe we're not smart enough. But I think the best guess is we can do it. And I think it's reasonably clear that if you can make computers that are as smart as human beings, then you can eventually make computers that are smarter than human beings. And that's why it is a scary thing as well as an interesting thing.
Before changing tack, just keeping with the singularity issues and stuff, I find that fascinating. One of the things they talk a lot is that at some point we'll be able to upload the brain or whatever, the content of the brain, and maybe download to a clone of yours.
Yes.
And then usually what I ask these guys, I say, okay, so then I can kill the original, I can kill you, and that would be David? What do you think to that? How do you answer that?
Killing me will still kill that David, and there will be another David over there. And as far as I am
But
concerned,
how about your
if I'm
individuality?
still this one,
Yep.
it will not make it all right for me, the fact that there's somebody else who's just like me who's still there. Because part of what I value are the things I can do, and the other one can still do those things, but part of what I value is myself, my own life, and I don't think you solve that problem in that way. No, the more interesting question,
Yes.
I had this conversation with Minsky, who was one of the real AI people many years ago, and what Minsky imagined is suppose what we do is we've got the computer that exactly emulates your brain.
Yes.
We take one little bit of it, and we reroute the circuits in your brain so that things go from this part of my brain through this part of the computer through back to my brain.
Okay.
We then remove the part of my brain that was running the equivalent of that. We repeat that step by step. So I'm continuously moving from me in here to me in there. Now is it still me, and now do we not care about the fact that my brain is dead when we're finished? And that's a much more interesting version because Minsky was a smart guy. And I don't know the answer to that. It hasn't happened. But no, just making copies, I don't think that, you know, if we have identical twins, that doesn't mean it's all right to kill one of them.
Let's talk a little bit about the society we envision. And I believe we have very similar opinions. We tend to think that a private law society would work better than the centralized government running it, so we might be called anarcho-capitalists. And you were mentioning whether or not this theoretical issue that I think is very interesting is whether or not we can have an endogenous law and order.
Yes.
As opposed to some entity like the government giving law and order to the system.
But we
Why
know
do you think?
we know the answer to that question.
Okay, what's the
We
answer?
don't know whether in a modern society you can have only that. But we know that in modern societies, there are in fact endogenous legal systems. If you think about how systems of norms work, that systems of norms are systems of rules, they are enforced, but they are enforced by the spontaneous behavior of other people.
Which ones are that?
The simple example that I like to give. There is nothing, when I was a professor, I just retired a few months ago.
Okay, congratulations.
There was nothing illegal about my stripping to my waist, taking off all my clothes above my waist before teaching a class. That would not have broken any laws.
I wouldn't like to see your class.
But it would have been a very foolish thing to do. And it would have been a foolish thing to do because there are social norms
Yes.
saying that in that kind, you know, it's all right on the beach, but that in a classroom you wear clothes. All right? So that would be a case where you have a rule. It is enforced by the reaction of other people. It's enforced by the fact that I know that if I did behave that way, other people would think worse of me. And it is a rule. Nobody passed it. It developed endogenously. So we know that you can have some systems of rules of that sort, because we do. We also know that there have been historical societies in which there was no government and in which things nonetheless functioned. One of my current writing projects is a book on legal systems very different from ours. That book has about 14 different chapters on different legal systems. The basic idea is that all human societies face about the same problems, that they solve them in an interesting variety of different ways, and that they're all grown-ups, and therefore you should take all of them seriously. Some of the societies I described there are societies which had no government and which functioned. That was true of northern Somalia for a long time. It was true of the Comanche Indians. The system I know best, which is not quite stateless but close, is Saga period Iceland. Iceland from about 930 to 1262 AD, so about 1,000 years ago. And that was a system where there was a law code and a legislature, but there was no executive arm of government. So there was no government enforcement of law. All enforcement was private. And that system produced one of the world's great literatures. The Icelandic Sagas are where we get the word saga from. And I'm talking about a society with a population of about 50,000 people, 1,000 years ago, in a far corner of the world, and there are probably a dozen books they wrote that are currently in print in English language paperbacks. So that's a pretty impressive accomplishment. It seems to have functioned pretty well for about 300 years, and all law enforcement was private. And there are other examples. The Comanche Indians were a stateless society. That's not a very attractive one, but it worked. It slowed expansion across Texas for 20 years or so, because in spite of the fact that they were outnumbered by the Americans and the Mexicans, and the Americans and the Mexicans had better guns, the Comanche were better at fighting, and so for a long time succeeded. So there have been quite a lot of examples of societies that functioned without what we would recognize as the government. Whether it would work in the modern world, we don't know. We haven't done the experiment, but my first book, I tried to sketch what I thought a society like that might look like in a modern society. And after I learned about people like the Icelanders and the Somali, I concluded I had been reinventing the wheel, that I had been thinking up on a theoretical basis a modern version of something of which primitive versions had already existed.
Another question, you mentioned at your speech tonight that defamation, slandering, and libel are becoming easier because it's easier to get access to anonymity.
There are two halves. The standard way of trying to prevent defamation in modern legal systems is to make it possible to sue somebody if somebody says things that aren't true about me that injure me, that I can sue him for slander or libel, depending on the form in which it was told. And there are two things you need for that to work. First, if somebody tells lies about me on a large enough scale to matter, I have to be able to find out who did it. And second, it's got to be somebody who has enough assets so it's worth suing him. Neither of those is true anymore. That with reasonable cleverness, you can set up a Facebook page or a web page on the internet, on the World Wide Web, without people finding out who you are. You can then put anything you like on it. It may eventually get taken down, but while it's up there, everybody in the world can see it. So if you can say interesting negative things about me that people want to read, they can do a Google search for my name, and you put my name all over the page. And so you can slander me without you having any substantial assets, and with luck, without my finding out who did it.
Let me tell you how the Brazilian government has been addressing badly this issue.
Tell me.
Any judge, local judge, if a corrupt politician would say, oh, they are defaming me or slandering me, he might be able to just take down everything that refers to it, from social media, everything.
But he can't. He isn't physically capable of it.
No, but they give the order to all providers, and they erase completely from the internet. Nobody knows that happened. It's like Big Brother.
Are you talking about asking Google to de-index it, or
Google
about asking...
de-indexes, all the providers are forbidden from showing it, and things disappear.
A Brazilian judge cannot control what I put on my webpage.
That's right. But as soon as the guy finds out about this, he might get a court order and remove everything very quickly.
But you say remove. He can get a court order and get those places that court has control over to remove it. But he can't get it removed from the entire web. Now, he might be able to get Google to de-index it.
That's right.
At which point it becomes harder to find it.
That's right.
But that depends on whether Google is willing to go along with that. And if Google does too much de-indexing, that will be a reason for other search engines to start competing with Google to offer the opportunity to do it.
Hasn't happened yet. Brazil is the world champion of taking down web pages, and Google still is the dominant web page. I hope it goes in the direction that
Maybe, but I don't know enough about the facts on that. There were some very interesting cases in the US which involved the same issue, but what was going on was that you were having, in effect, fake law cases, so that you say something I don't like, which is not actually untrue.
That's
online,
right.
And I want to get it taken down. So I go to a court and claim that she said something negative about me there. She's my friend. So she says, yes, I agree, I concede. I then get an order which goes to Google, and that takes down the thing which she actually wasn't doing, but which somebody else was doing.
benefits you.
And that one got caught. And at this point, those things are going back up again. And to some extent, the people who did it, in particular lawyers who were engaged in a deliberate fraud, are getting into trouble. But I doubt that's going to happen to Brazilian judges. But I don't think that's an effective mechanism. And of course, the point you're making, I think, is that not only is it not an effective mechanism, it's not an effective mechanism for taking out false statements because it can be used to take down true statements.
That's
too.
right.
So of course, you could get rid of the whole problem by simply shutting down the internet. Suppose the Brazilian government says it is illegal for anybody to produce internet connections.
But they don't want to do that.
Yes, but all I'm saying is that saying it is possible to do it in ways that would do more damage than good isn't really all that interesting.
Another question. Brazil is known worldwide for being the country of taxes. We have 82 taxes. It's crazy here. You don't even want to know. Let me ask you, do you think taxes are the moral equivalent to theft?
Well, to begin with, as I usually point out when people ask me if taxes are theft, no, they're robbery. The difference, people don't always use the words that way, but insofar as they're a difference, theft is a secret taking and robbery is an open taking.
Okay.
And government is some taxes are theft in that you don't know they're happening, but most taxes you know perfectly well they're happening. And I would have said that from my standpoint, I don't see a good argument for why government has the right to do things other people don't have a right to do. So in that sense, it's robbery. But then the question is, many people, most people, think that without government, terrible things would happen. Right. So if they are right in believing that if the government doesn't rob me of half my income, private thieves will rob me of 3/4 of my income, in that case, having a government would be the least best solution. Now, I don't think that's the case, but I can understand other people disagree with me. So from that standpoint, you would have to say that perhaps it is robbery, but robbery that we have to put up with on the grounds that the alternative is even worse robberies. I hope that's not the case. Now, I don't think you can make a very good case along those lines for very much of government, in the sense that I don't know about Brazil, but that the US and Britain in the 19th century, government spent about 10% of national income. And those were places that had laws and police and functioning societies. So my guess is that even short of what you and I want, which is a completely stateless society, you could pretty clearly have a functioning Brazil or the US with only 10% of income. US governments currently spend about 40% of all income. So therefore, that suggests that at least 30 of that is not only robbery, it's unnecessary robbery, since you could prevent the rest of the robbery without it. But of course, other people could disagree about that too. They might say things have changed in some way. But there are really, I think, two classes of arguments for government doing things. One of them are the arguments that claim it's not really robbery, so that standard social contract and things of that sort.
Right.
And the other are the arguments which say, well, yes, it is robbery, but it happens to be the least bad alternative we've got. And that could be right, although My guess is it's not.
Yeah, I would agree to that. It's wrong. Anyway, what is your view on morality? Do you believe in good and bad?
Yes.
And how do you incorporate that into your work?
I guess to some extent, in what I decide to do, I would rather do work that I think makes the world better than work that I think makes the world worse. On the other hand, my main priority is to try to find out what's true, and sometimes finding out what's true might have bad effects, so that's a risk of doing research or being an academic of any sort. I think that some things are actually good and bad. I don't have a good theory of why, but I find it very difficult to believe the alternative, to believe that really torturing children to death is no worse than anything else you can do. That doesn't seem to me an intuitively plausible idea. I find somewhat convincing the idea that there seems to be a great deal in common among the moral beliefs of different people, that they differ in detail, but in a broad sense, you could say that most human societies, most people believe about the same kinds of things, that I don't know of any human societies that thought that torturing children to death was a good thing to do. And I think most societies have thought that it's good for people to be happy, it's good for people not to starve to death, it's good to be healthy, a lot of things of that sort. So that at least suggests that we are observing a set of moral facts that we can all see, even when we see them imperfectly. That I came to this opinion as a result of losing an argument when I was about 18 years old. I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and I got into an interesting argument with a philosopher by the name of Isaiah Berlin, who happened to be visiting Harvard at the time. And my position at the time was that moral beliefs were tastes, that the fact that I thought things were good was like the fact that I like chocolate better than vanilla.
Why did you change?
Because he persuaded me not that the case for morality was that much better than I thought it was, but that the case for objective reality was weaker than I thought it was. That after all, how do I really know that you're really there? It's after all possible that's all an illusion. Maybe it's, maybe I'm crazy and I'm just seeing somebody who isn't here. Maybe I'm lying in bed asleep, or maybe I'm a brain in a vat or something. And it seemed to me that he was right, that if you thought about why I believe in objective reality, basically it's because my senses tell me things. I then apply all the consistency tests that I can apply. For example, I not only see you, if I reach out, I touch you. So that's some evidence. I not only see you, I hear you. I get what seems to be a consistent picture of the world. Now, it's not impossible that it's all wrong, but that makes it less likely that it's all wrong. If it's all my imagination, it seems likely that I will hear you and not see you, or hear you and see you and not touch you, and things of that sort. So in that sense...
But how do you go from is to ought, the David Hume?
I'm not going from is to ought.
Okay.
What I'm doing is saying that my basis for ought is like my basis for is. They're two independent sets of propositions. But that the particular example that I remember Isaiah Berlin using was he said, suppose you observe somebody who goes around sticking pins in people. And you say to him, why do you stick pins in people? He says, well, I like the feeling of a pin going into a resilient object. It's like that. I say, great. Here's a rubber ball. Why don't you stick pins in that instead? And he says, oh, thank you. That's very nice. It doesn't squeal and hit me when I stick pins in it. And he goes around sticking pins in the rubber ball instead. He's crazy.
Right.
Why is he crazy? Because just as sitting around the dining room table, not only do I not see a lion on the table, nobody else sees a lion on the table. That everybody, one of the consistency tests is that people perceive reality, at least the brute facts of reality, about the same way. They reach different conclusions from what they see. That one person will say socialism is best, one person will say capitalism is best. But both of them are seeing the same things when they're in front of them. Similarly, everybody's reaction to the story about sticking pins in is the guy is crazy, that people disagree in detail, but everybody agrees that human pain matters. And that therefore, saying that you should be indifferent between sticking a pin in a human and sticking a pin in a rubber ball means you're crazy. You're morally crazy. That your view of moral facts diverges from the rest of us, just like the guy who thinks there's a lion on the dining room table diverges from the rest of us. So it seemed to me that was a reasonably good argument. You then think about it, and one of the experiences you have if you argue politics is when you're taking theoretical conditions and saying what's right and what's wrong, it's very hard to get the socialists and the capitalists to agree on their starting conditions. All right, the question is it wrong to steal? Well, when I'm imagining it, I'm saying, well, look, there's this big forest, and one person went into the forest and he cleared land and he planted crops and he built himself a house, he did all these things, and the other guy wandered around eating fruit. And then in a year or two, when there was a harsh winter, that other guy said, I'm starving to death, give me your stuff. That's clearly wrong. But then how does the socialist see it? No, his story is very different. His story is one guy went into the forest and he cleared the land and he planted crops. Then an evil capitalist came over and somehow he tricked himself into getting possession of that. And then he objects to the guy who did the work taking it back again. So it looks as though we have the same basic moral standards. And in order to get different conclusions, we have to implicitly assume different worlds. And I'm exaggerating. It's not that simple. We'll sometimes disagree. But I think there's enough in common to suggest that the basis for large parts of disagreement are disagreements about the physical world. But we know the physical, at least we believe the physical world is real. So if we end up disagreeing about the physical world at least as much as about the moral world, then our grounds for saying, I think it's really there because there's a consistency in people's perception, are comparably good for the moral world. And that gives you the argument which philosophers call intuitionism for justifying the idea that there's a moral world out there. So that would be the argument that I would make. I sometimes describe this as Catholicism without God, because it assumes moral reality. I think moral realism is another term philosophers use for the general position, but it's a particular version of moral realism in which moral beliefs are real, and I conclude they're real because I observe enough consistency in different people observing them. Now, it's certainly not a proof. I mean, there are counter-arguments you can make, and I can see, if I wanted to argue against this, I can make arguments against it, but since I can make arguments both for and against it, and I do not find myself psychologically capable of believing that there are no moral rights or wrongs, I prefer to follow the arguments that fit my intuitions.
David, thank you very much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. I enjoyed myself as well.
Thank you.
Right.